This is the first in a series of 4 seminars to help the Institute for Government with a project on the development and hopefully the improvement of the operation of public service markets. We're very grateful to you all for coming, and as well as to A4E and the Guardian Public Leaders Network for working with us to help make this event possible. Now, since the late 1980s, in many sectors, particularly in welfare, health, social care, local government, there's been a steady trend, at least viewed in the long term, towards outsourcing, not just of back office functions like payroll and finance, but of direct services to the public. There have been plenty of steps backwards and forwards and off that road as we've gone along. And of course, throughout history, it's never been without controversy. I mean, in health right now, it's probably never been more controversial. But it's equally clear that despite 20 years plus history of this, the ability to contract well for these services probably remains pretty much in its infancy. How do we manage such markets well? How do you decide where they're appropriate? How do you ensure the taxpayer gets value for money, an efficient, effective and quality service at a fair price? And these seminars are part of the Institute's wider work on public services as we seek to understand the latest thinking in design and governance of these programmes and how lessons learnt might be applied to the future. There's a handout on your seat that explains all this in some more detail. Now, today's event is, of course, about welfare-to-work programmes, perhaps in a sense with some of the benefit changes linked to that. And while the aim is to learn from history, we're not going to try and take a linear approach, but examine the history through a number of themes. I mean, chief amongst these were what were the forces for change, what were the obstacles to be overcome, how successfully were they tackled, and what could have been done differently. And from that, what lessons can be learned not just for this sector, but for public service markets more generally. We've got a highly distinguished panel, most of whom I'm sure will be known to most of you, but just in case. Working from my far right, they consist of Dan Finn, Professor of Social Inclusion at the University of Portsmouth, Lee Lewis, who was head of the Employment Service when the very first of these contracts was let, way back in the 1990s, and went on to be Permanent Secretary at DWP. James Purnell, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions from January 2008 to 2009, and Kirsty McHugh, who's Chief Executive of URSA, the Employment Related Services Association, which represents both the private and voluntary contractors in these areas. We'll start with Dan Finn and James discussing the forces for change, and then Lee Lewis and Kirsty McHugh will discuss some of the successes and ups and downs on the way, and then we'll finish with a broader discussion around the lessons learned, at which point, if not before, I hope that plenty of you will join in this conversation. You should probably know this event is being videoed and will be available online later, so everything said is on the record. It's a lot of ground to cover in an hour, so let's get going. Dan, would you like to make a start?
Okay, and I am going to do some history because I think it's very important to know where we come from and not think we're starting from a blank sheet. Forces for change. One of the key forces for change is clearly the re-emergence of mass unemployment in the 1980s. The need to build up capacity quickly, massively, largely in that era through the voluntary sector and through local authorities to react to those kind of changes in the form of things like the community programme and youth training programmes, and then the creation of a provider network in that era, many of whom still exist in one form or another, many of whom have fallen by the way in the intervening kind of period. The second force of change I'd identify is the public sector reform agenda of the first waves of Conservative government that introduced the idea of quasi-markets, the use, the movement away from public sector bureaucracies and hierarchical bureaucracies towards more competitive kind of marketplaces, and the creation in that era of the Trade and Enterprise Councils. Because to some extent we've already had one experience of a major experiment with market forces of a particular type when policy making in this country was most influenced by the USA model of the Job Training and Partnership Act and the private industry councils that operated in that period. That's when we saw the arrival of, in a very embryonic form, outcome-related funding and the creation of, I guess, a prime contractor market, except it was a locality-based one in the form of techs who commissioned their own provider networks in those kinds of areas. It's really important to understand some of the kind of problems that emerged in that period, because that explains some of why the employment service then contracted the new deals in the way that it actually did, which became the problem that Freud thought he was unravelling in 2007. So I just wanted to get that out there as one of the kind of bits of history. Forces of change, mass unemployment, the need to, the creation of kind of quasi-markets more generally in public services, but specifically their specific form in this kind of era. Crucially, and Lee can probably tell us more about this, the Employment Service went through a whole set of market tests, and the conclusion, even under the Thatcher governments and the major governments, was that the key functions of the Public Employment Service should be kept within the public sector. Job broking, advisory work, and placement work. Many other activities were contracted out. We then arrive in the 1997, when recent history seems to begin. I'll take a longer view, and I've not bored you with labour exchanges back to Beveridge and the Salvation Army in the 1890s. There's a long history, or even the history of the Poor Laws, which takes us even further back. But recent history in 1997, 3 reasons why there's, again, a big surge in the provider market. One is the need to kind of add capacity. The new deals have to get up and running very quickly to deliver on manifesto pledges, and the government chose, with the Employment Service, chose to give the kind of key role to the Employment Service, but also as the commissioner of a set of services. Crucially, the type of contracting model that was used then was partly a reaction to some of the weaknesses of the tech contracting model. So we have to understand that to understand what then became caricatured as a prescriptive, top-down, not very flexible form of contracting that then Freud and John Hutton, when he was Secretary of State, start to unwind. The second kind of issue was obviously the commissioning of specialist services. You know, the Public Employment Service can't do everything, it needs to commission things in. And the third thing, and this was new, was contestability. The idea of contesting what the core Public Employment Service did. And one of the interesting things from looking at the experiments taking place in Europe at the moment is one of the remarkable kind of impacts of introducing outcome-based contracts and using private contractors is it forces an improvement in Public Employment Service performance. And that's a very interesting kind of finding. And in most of the experiences taking place in Europe at the moment, the Public Employment Service delivers better than the private sector, but there are reasons for that which we can explore in discussion. So that to me is the kind of the background to the emergence in the 2006-2008 period of the new impetus to actually to create self-consciously a market in this kind of era, in this field. It's the combination in this era of a revitalised public sector reform agenda alongside the experience of the contestability strategy with some evidence from employment zones that they were performing better, that were providing more flexible services. And one other force for change I'd like to identify is the crucial emergence of a provider interest in this kind of field, and a provider interest that starts to attract new entrants into the market. And crucially, there's a history to be written, I think, about the role of things like the CBI, of organisations more latterly like URSA, about the role in which they kind of promote a version of how contracting should be developed and how the welfare market should be taken forward. So my 3 forces for change, for what they're worth: the emergence of mass unemployment, the public sector reform agenda, and allied to that, the emergence of a provider interest which is able to do it. Finally, there's the intractable problems of getting people into jobs. Okay, I'll finish there.
Great. James.
Well, thank you, Nick, and it's a great pleasure to be here. You overlooked one crucial aspect of the policy for which I was responsible, which was the creation of the New Deal for Musicians in 1998, which followed a very evidence-based policy process, which was the NME had a front cover with lots of musicians criticising the government, and within 2 days we had a new option on the New Deal for Young People, which Lee then made me abolish about 10 years later, which is one definition of joined-up policy. I think I just want to say it's a great pleasure to be on this panel, particularly with Lee, who I regard as being one of the great civil servants, and the fact that this policy has succeeded in this way is in no small part due to him. Just picking up where Dan started, because I think actually the point about text is really interesting, because I think one of the great dangers here is if we don't define our terms, we can actually end up with really bad policy. It can sound a bit pedantic to define our terms, but actually it's really important to think about what we mean by markets. Because actually I'm not even sure that in one way this is a market. You know, obviously it's not a market where people can refuse to supply or where the price goes up and down, but it's not even really a market in the sense, or quasi-market in the sense that education would be, where to a certain extent the direction of implementation and even of policy is led by interactions between parents, pupils and providers. To a certain extent, a minister can think, well, okay, in education, they can create a system which will then decide where it goes through the interaction of those individuals. In welfare, that is just not the case. There is very little choice by the individual for lots of reasons. We don't want to give the individual choice of that kind. And so I would describe this more as contestability, as Dan said, rather than as markets. Some of the reasons why the techs failed, which Lee and I were also involved with abolishing, some of the reason why the techs failed at the beginning was that no one had actually really defined what the role of a market meant. Lots of people who went on the boards of techs, business people, thought that they were going to be in charge of the direction of policy in their area, whilst at the same time the government was trying to actually be quite specific in some of the things that it was telling them to do, like, for example, having a youth training guarantee. So for people who couldn't get on youth training, that there would be some kind of offer there for them. So there was a contradiction built into that concept of the use of markets in employment right from the start. And I think if we look at what happened picking up with the start of history in 1997, if we look at what happened there, I think it's interesting to note that this was probably the earliest example of the use of the private sector and contestability in public services of the Labour government, and actually slightly at odds with what was going on elsewhere. In health, Frank Dobson was busily closing down any such dangerous ideas. In education, although David Blunkett was a big reformer on the education side, it was very much about a sort of target-led, top-down reform built around the numeracy and literacy hour. So a couple of uses of the private sector, for example, in Hackney, had its LEA role taken away from it. But actually, this was the pioneer. And interestingly, it was led by Gordon Brown and Geoffrey Robinson. And talking to Lee earlier, we were wondering why that would happen. I think it was partly because they came in with a view of the employment service, which wasn't totally flattering. Partly Geoffrey's business background, I guess. Partly also, I think, the fact that welfare is maybe an easier area to do this in than health or education. It's less something which goes to the core of policy debate, certainly at that time, and not something where you've got a sort of a group of people who are using it day in, day out, who have such strong voices. But then what's interesting is, having done that, having been pioneers, used the private sector, then quite a big pause after 1998. Less to do with this particular bit of the policy, but more to do with the general problems around the Lone Parents Revolt, the early attempts to reform disability benefits, which led to very high-profile protests around outside 10 Downing Street, and then just a general sense that this policy had become too dangerous and therefore needed to be calmed down, and no better person to do so than Alistair Darling, who came in and did so fantastically effectively and concentrated with Lee on the creation of Job Centre Plus and that whole spine of really a public service-led side of reform. At the same time as that was happening around the system, a couple of things continued to bubble away. Action Team for Jobs, some good evidence about that. And so then after a long pause in 2005, when you get John Hutton coming in as Secretary of State, the first person who, to put it subtly, feels that he has an independent role in policy making from Caxton House, he's very, very keen on promoting the use of contestability. And we start to get to a new settlement where it's not so much that the private sector is seen as better than the public sector, but it's more that certainly John and I both thought that a system in which there was contestability and the ability for the system to reform itself by there being different options between the private and the public sector, that is the best way of improving delivery. Having said that, and I'll finish on this point, both John and I came in I'm sure some people would say, as fairly evangelical about the use of the private sector. But I think both of us were convinced that actually in DWP you wanted to have a strong spine around Job Centre Plus to deliver the essence of the system. And indeed David Freud, when he looked at this independently, concluded the same, that actually Job Centre Plus is pretty well set up to do the first part of the claim, which is relatively standard, relatively routine. And in particular, I remember very clearly a conversation with Lee where he said to me, look, it's fine contracting out when you've got a system which is fairly stable, but if you ever need to change your policy direction very quickly, you would be very glad to still have Job Centre Plus as your main engine of delivery. And indeed, when the global recession hit, I was very glad to have Job Centre Plus, because you could then just get get Leslie Strathey, who we should remember in this context, in and say, could you just change the direction of policy? And, well, it happened. Whereas it's an interesting question to ask ourselves whether that would be just as easy if we had had to do that through contracted providers.
Great, James, many thanks. Just move on and talk a bit now about the successes and failures and difficulties on the way. Lee, would you like to reflect on that?
And thank you. And I too am delighted to be here, though it's a bit scary actually, because I've spent most of the last year forgetting the little I ever knew about this subject, and that's going to be brutally found out, I think, by some of the people in the room. And then in such distinguished company, sitting next to one of the Secretary of States I served. And I do remember New Deal for musicians. But James and I, for a price, will tell you about the time I persuaded James to undertake free swimming against his better judgment in the interests of the nation. But I've been asked to talk about some of the successes. What were the successes in overcoming the obstacles to using markets in welfare? And I think in a bit, just as Dan and James have done, actually you need to step back, because I think in some senses, if you take the great sweep of history, I think the jury is still out on whether it can be convincingly and absolutely demonstrated that outcomes have been better through the use of the private sector as compared with a state-delivered model, at least in terms of the comparative performance between private sector and public sector providers. I have no judgments to pass at all. I'm not in any way involved with the work programme and how that may be faring. I think some of the early indications are very positive, but I think it's probably too early to pass judgment. But such comparative work as was done on earlier programmes tended to suggest that the differences in outcomes between the private and the public providers were not huge, not either as large as its protagonists would have liked to have seen, nor remotely as small as some of its detractors would have liked to have seen. And to the extent that there were some marginal differences in outcomes, again, it was arguable that they owed more to some of the constraints that the public sector delivery agencies were under, compared with the greater, not complete freedoms that private sector providers had. That said, you know, trying to kind of look back on this across a sweep of a decade and a half, I'm in no doubt that the opening up of this market of contestability, of additional providers, has had powerful overall benefits to the system. It's undoubtedly encouraged innovation. The more players you have, the more organisations are involved and individuals are involved, undoubtedly the more innovation you get. I think Dan is 100% right that actually the advent of competition, for want of a better word, has over that period stimulated public sector providers to be much better, not just a bit better, but much better than they would otherwise have been, left with a sort of classic natural monopoly. And I think actually, and James commented on this, I think that we've begun to see emerge a sort of some understanding of where the two players, the classic public sector deliverer and the more private or third sector market, can deploy their respective strengths well. And I think all of those have been serious benefits. To the extent we have overcome obstacles, why have we overcome obstacles? What got us to the place where, you know, kind of from that standing start that James described, we now have a market which is far more open, far more players, far more diverse, and delivering a much wider range of opportunity. There's been, I think, more consensus actually across the political divide than might be immediately apparent from the sort of the frenzy and the sound of political gunfire echoing backwards and forwards. I went back in, former DWP colleagues in the room, I promise you I don't do this on a daily basis, but I went back into the DWP website yesterday and, of course, spent hours and hours, you know, just it's utterly fascinating.
Your speeches were always very
My
fascinating.
speeches were fascinating. Now, the interesting thing is you can get into speeches of current ministers very quickly, because you'd expect that, wouldn't you? But if you really are a bit determined, you can still get into speeches of previous ministers, of previous administrations. And I got into a speech that James gave in 2009, entitled Welfare 2020. And not in every respect, that would be wrong. But actually, it was remarkable how some of what James was saying could be being said today by a government of a different colour. So I think actually there has been over this period more political consensus than was always apparent from the cut and thrust of political debate. I think we've had some determined political leadership during that period from secretaries of state of both political parties, including the distinguished Secretary of State immediately to my left. And actually, I also think that one of the reasons that we've seen success is that however wonderful and comforting and endearing the classic yes minister image is of we've seen it all before, you know, kind of we tried it in 1803 and it failed then, so would you like to just go away, etc., etc. I think actually that the key departments involved, not just DWP but others as well, have actually put their shoulder behind this wheel in a real and serious way for successive governments and been willing to learn from experience. I'll shut up in a moment, I promise. Are all the obstacles overcome? No, absolutely not. I think, for me at least, the jury is still out on whether it is possible through this mixed economy to deliver a set of outcomes that are indisputably better, grander for the society as a whole, as well as long-term unemployed and disadvantaged people, than would otherwise be the case. And perhaps we're beginning to see that, but I don't know that you could prove it yet in a PhD thesis. I think throughout all of these programs, we've been better at getting people into jobs than sustaining them in those jobs. I think that still is the harder part. As someone who now, in his part-time retirement, chairs the Board of Trustees of a third sector body, I don't think we've cracked really how we get the third sector involved in the delivery in this mixed economy. We make lots of grand-sounding statements as to how vital they are and how important it is, but actually when you're sitting on the board of a medium-sized charity, it don't look that easy. And I'm not sure that we have found, perhaps we never should, long-term stability between the roles of the public and the private sector. But what a fascinating journey it's been.
Lee, thanks very much. Kirsty.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be talking about something which isn't the work programme, is it working? Because I'm completely fed up with that, I have to say, and I get asked again and again and again. And I'm sure I will be tomorrow when there will be the release of some limited data around work programme referrals. Interesting challenge being asked to talk about the successes of welfare to work, and there obviously have been a lot of successes. But there's also been a range of consequences, which I think we need to be aware of in relation to this discussion. And you know, three very distinguished people here are able to talk a lot about the past. If you don't mind, I'm going to talk about the more recent history, maybe the last sort of, 15, 16, 18 months, something along those lines. So, what were the successes? Well, first and foremost, sort of self-evidently, a market has been created, and that is a mixed market. We do have Job Centre Plus in terms of the public sector, and it's not just the private sector provision out there, there's a lot of voluntary sector provision as well. The membership of my organisation is pretty much 50-50 between private and voluntary. And if you look at the mix of organisations, not necessarily the level, but the mix of sectors, there's a lot of voluntary sector organisations involved there as well as the private sector ones. Secondly, we have to some extent moved away from that plethora of programmes that were organised around benefit type or industry, musicians or not, or age, etc. Because people don't fall into those sort of simple categories. We know that their barriers to work aren't that simple, and the new provision does get over that obstacle to some extent. And thirdly, we do seem to have learned some of the lessons from the past, and in the handout you've got, I think that spells that out, in terms of a commitment to black box, differential payments, payment by results, longer contracts, which do incentivise more investment in staff and in partnerships. I think some of those lessons have been learnt in terms of programme design. At the same time, I think you've got an industry that's been maturing. And I don't think, from what I've heard, the welfare to work would have identified itself as an industry a few years ago. There's those in the room here who know far more about this than I. But it does now. And it has a trade association, which has been in place since 2005. It has its own qualifications now. It's going to get its own institute. So the employment-related services area is now a fully fledged sector. And I think it's been growing up. And some of the good things which have been coming through have been because of that, and not just because of what government has been doing. And that's a healthy thing, I think, in terms of the market. But there have been a range of other consequences as well. And I think some of that is because the government isn't necessarily quite comfortable, or not all the bits of government are comfortable with the sort of market that's been created. You know, voluntary sector, Lee's already picked up. We know there's parts of government that does want the voluntary sector to be seen to be playing a much bigger role than it has been hitherto. But we don't have the funding models. You know, we haven't cracked it. You know, we don't have enough voluntary sector organisations that have got the capacity to be prime contractors. And the voluntary sector is different. And so I think there's a job of work to be done. And there are parts of the government that I think would like that job of work to be done. And I think there's other parts of government who frankly don't care. And I'm very conscious of that video looking at me, but there are some tensions there. I think there's also tensions around that localist agenda. And we know that there are parts of government that really think that localism is very important. But we also know that the work programme was centrally procured, it's regionally delivered, or sub-regionally delivered in terms of CPAs. Then you have local deliver, but it's top-down, and there's no point pretending otherwise. The local element doesn't fit into that. And so I think there's an element of discomfort there, which I think we'll be able to find ways through that, but there's different starting points. And I think there's also some tension within government in terms of how much this is a self-regulated market. You know, how black box is black box, how much do you just hand over the responsibility for the delivery to the industry. And I can see different tensions and, you know, different drivers, and that could go in a number of different directions, I think. So, you know, the jury's out there as well. And then another really important point for me is this whole issue of risk transfer. And we do have the Minister saying repeatedly, well, you know, we've transferred the risk to the providers in relation to welfare to work policies. And that's part of the whole point, you transfer risk. But I have to say, no, you haven't, government. You can't transfer all financial risk, or indeed reputational risk, by the contracting out of all services. There's a mutual dependency there which is never going to go away. And, you know, I think we need to be aware of that as well. At the same time, we're in a situation where the lessons, as such, from that journey of you know, and it is an evolution of welfare to work, and the work programme, the new provision, is more evolutionary than it is revolutionary. You know, I know that people like to think the world started in 1997 or 2010, etc. There has been more continuity than anything else. But we are seeing some of those lessons around sort of payment by results and public service reform being sort of potentially rolled out across government quite fast. And I think we probably do need to sort of step back a bit and think about sort of some of you know, what has been learned and what the implications of that are. You know, can we apply payment by results? You know, early intervention programs, maybe. Ex-offenders, maybe. But it's not a straightforward conversation about these things. And you know, again, more work to be done there as well. Finally, I think we will see more policy layering than maybe the government may have wanted. You know, there'll be layering of new customer groups and interventions, etc., into the work programme as the new global brand. But there'll also be new programmes and activities pushed on top. Ministers won't be able to resist it. You know, we've had a very sort of stable lot of ministers so far in terms of this coalition government. It may continue to be the case, but it may not. And I think we will see that policy layering and sort of new things coming on board as well. So some of the reflections on successes and the consequences of those successes, you know, very much from a recent point of view, which I hope complements some of the lessons from the past. I'm very conscious of that video and the fact that everything I've said is on camera.
Guess many thanks indeed. We're going to move on to broader lessons and things, but can I raise a couple of points? I mean, it seems to be one of the crucial things here is this argument about whether it's contestability that leads to improvement, or whether the private sector is actually better at this. Because it seems to me, if you look back at the evidence that the private sector delivers better than the public sector is actually pretty limited. It's there for the employment zones. And beyond that, not a lot. And so, I mean, if I was being devil's advocate, I say, isn't this just, you know, there's been a huge statement of faith here repeatedly by successive governments that using the private sector will deliver a better outcome. So is it about private sector performance, or is it simply about contestability?
Well, I mean, I think that was always a bit of a straw man, and I always tried to be very clear that it wasn't a view that the private sector was better than the public sector, but that contestability, when used in the right place, it's not always the right place, but when used in the right place, could improve results overall because it brought the best out of the public and the private. And actually, I think one of the interesting things in retrospect is whether having parts of the system where there's no public sector comparator is a good idea or not. I mean, that's actually something which we did with Flexible New Deal. We said it would all be delivered by private and voluntary providers. I guess in retrospect, I worry a little bit that that means that if you get the incentive structure wrong, and you sort of create an incentive for the market to go in one direction, you haven't then got a public sector comparator to say, which allows you to say, actually, okay, you've all gone off here, but actually it was possible to do better because we know that the Job Centre Plus one or the Working Links one or whatever it is has done exactly that. And I do think that's linked to the other point about what exactly you are devolving here, which is when Kirsty says that the current government stance is that they've transferred the risk. I think, again, it's very important to be clear about what we mean by that. Transferring the risk, of course, for their performance and for their financial performance, but I don't think they are, and I noticed this was a response to the recent NAA report, I don't think they're transferring the risk for the policy, because it's very clear the outcomes that are being specified, the system that is being set up, and it must continue to be the case that ministers are accountable for the overall performance of the work programme. Not for the individual performance of the provider, but the overall performance of the work programme, and that I think is a pretty uncontroversial point.
Yeah.
Dan, Lee, does you have any?
Just a couple of observations. One is the contestability, okay, takes us so far in terms of understanding where this comes from. One of my takes on this is that there are two big things going on with the work programme, and prior to that where Labour was going with the strategy. And they're less to do with Job Centre Plus. One big thing is a reorganisation of the existing network of providers. And the logic of that is towards a network of a smaller network of larger, better performing providers. I think that's ultimately the logic. And one of the things the department has done is to subcontract that decision to prime providers. Yeah? However, it's now in the business of actually creating strings because of the political pressures it's under, which mean that prime providers may not be able to do that in the way that actually you would want them to do, such as keeping the voluntary sector involved, keeping a range of provision out there, when the logic of the market might be consolidation, a smaller number of better performing providers out there, because that's the lesson from the Australian kind of market. The other big thing that's going on is the PFI model, which is, and I think the key insight from Freud, which is, can we use future investment now? Can we get the private sector to invest now to bring in these new groups who were previously receiving no services, that actually have very little contact with Job Centre Plus in the first place? So the issue about Job Centre Plus and this market has moved on now. I mean, what we've lost is contestability with that first year of provision, and maybe we need a bit more contestability there. But to me, it's that reorganisation of the market, subcontracted out, but now the strings are starting to emerge, because I think this is what happens with re-regulations, and also that engagement with those massive groups of people on incapacity benefit who previously were receiving no services.
I mean, just to add one thought, because there's an awful lot there, as James and Dan said, with which I agree. I don't think we should underestimate it at all, that stimulus effect that this whole journey has had on bringing up the whole level of provision and bringing innovation and change into the system. And, kind of when I use phrases now, I remember in 1997, my kids look at me as if I'm sort of Homer Simpson. But I do remember being in the employment service in 97. I can see one or two faces in the room, like Pat's, who were there with me. When employment zones were first mooted, when private sector New Deal areas were first mooted, and the general reaction amongst lots of people in the then employment service is, why are they doing this to us? We were very quick to want to fall into a kind of victim culture.
I can remember you being very, very cautious about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, you kept saying, I'm not sure about this.
What we did was to sit back and once we'd got over the sort of the feelings of injustice which were there, is how can we actually take advantage of that? And that, for example, led to the creation of something called Working Links, which is still a major provider today, and a complete revolution in how we began to think about our role.
Yeah, great.
Just wanted to anecdote, if I may, from which you'll be able to draw no conclusions whatsoever. One of my members, one of the prime contractors, their supply chain, they say they've got a public sector top performer, and the bottom performer is also a public sector agency. So it isn't uniform, absolutely not uniform in any shape or form.
Can I start to bring you in? Is anyone steaming to disagree violently with anything that's been said so far? So if you are, put your hand up and shout, or indeed think something's gone wrong in the interpretation of this. Sort of kind of silence out there. Yes.
Ian Mulhern, Social Market Foundation. Oh, thank you. I was quite interested in this point about risk transfer, Kirsty, that you were talking about, because that, to me, seems to be the big sticking point for this whole agenda. And the problem seems to be that how do you not transfer the risk of the macroeconomy tanking, which is, you know, a lot of these policies developed in a much more benign time, and, you know, maybe they were much more sensible for those kind of times. And now the question is, well, can you put these outcome risks on providers, and then the economy tanks, they don't get any jobs, and the only way they can survive is by cutting services at the front line. It seems to me unless we can solve that problem, then this might be the high watermark of markets in welfare, and I just wondered what the panel thought about that.
I mean, I think it's not just the economic risk. The other big difference with when the Freud report was written is money's become much more expensive and certainly much scarcer. So, you know, I think that was written at a time when David was getting the city saying quite often, look, we've got lots of money we want to invest and we want to find places to put it. I'd be interested if providers think differently, but my impression is not that this policy is basically leading to huge amounts of borrowing from the city to then fund extra interventions over and above what people would expect in the contracts to get to people who were currently outside the system, or to get interventions which weren't being funded. It looks to me much more like, you know, the primes are funding broadly the kind of service which they would have got previously, but it's happening under a different contractual system. So it seems to me less a move towards a big invest-to-save world, and more to one where, you know, the contractualisation has been normalised. In passing, was it really worth getting rid of Flexible New Deal? Are there huge differences between the work programme and Flexible New Deal? Was it worth £63 million of written-off costs? Interesting questions for other people to form judgments on. I think in particular what I would ask myself is whether the incentives are sharp enough in the outsourcing or the franchising of these systems. So not just in this market, but with offenders, as you were saying. I think if organisations who get these contracts are really to behave in the way that ministers and officials want, there has to be quite a lot of pain if policy off is not achieved. So if people are doing much worse than is expected, and there has to be a really big gain if they really shift the dial and they get improved performance. And that would be my test, not in this particular area, but in general, for whether the policy will achieve the great hopes that people have of it.
Grand. Just go back in the middle at one point. You described, there was this sort of huge amount of energy early on with the new deals, then there was this pause in the middle. Yeah. You said it was all sort of felt a bit dangerous and difficult. Lee, is that your perception of why it slowed? I mean, I just kind of felt the steam went out of it for a while, and we got round to Pathways to Work, and with, you know, very slow pilots.
I think that the system was, by that time, trying to do a great deal. It had moved from dealing with the classic long-term or young unemployed to focusing much more on people on long-term incapacity benefits. And that was a harder puzzle in one sense, because the issues, the complexities were more. Remember, and can I remember the economic cycle? We went through in that period some quite benign years, if you see what I mean, where public attention had moved to other issues rather more. Yeah. Kind of when you're in an economic downturn is when the focus tends to be at its.
And was it also because the department was doing Job Centre Plus at the time, so that was presumably a huge management commitment to get, a highly successful programme, but it must have taken.
it was a huge management commitment, but no, I don't think that sudden. I don't ever remember us turning round to ministers of any colour and saying, no, we have to stop everything else because we're rolling out 1,000 job centre plus offices. I think it were other factors more than that.
And can I ask one more question around that, which is was it necessary to have the benefit changes, the movement to employment support allowance, in the sense to get into the disability area effectively? I mean, there must be some link between changing the benefit structure.
I think I'm so conscious that somebody is filming all of this, and I am not going to enter into matters of political controversy, other than I think to say that to many of us working for many years in the department and its predecessor and in the agencies, whatever they were called at the time, the benefit system seemed to have many perversities in it. It seemed to have many perverse incentives that led to people acting in ways that were far from ideal. If you just take, the numbers of people on long-term incapacity benefits that rose from something like 750,000 to peak at 2.8 million over only slightly more than 20 years. I think you're hard-pressed to say that part of that was not about the perverse incentives in the benefit system. If you were unemployed, you were on a benefit which paid you less and made you do more. If you could get your doctor to sign you off onto incapacity benefits, you were on a system which paid you more and asked you to do very little, and indeed at times nothing. So I think within this is inextricably bound up with changes to the benefit system.
Right. Chris?
Chris Nicholson from Centre Forum, the Liberal think tank, and in a previous life was very involved in advising on Flexible New Deal Phase 1 to the department. Nick mentioned the lull that there was in the early 2000s and mentioned pilots. And I think there's an interesting question for policymakers about pilots, because if you're approaching policy logically in a new area, the logical thing to do, in some ways, would be to have pilots, test the results, and then decide whether to proceed. On the other hand, if you did that, there'd be long periods when you were not actually implementing policy. So clearly with the work programme, that has been done in a very big bang way, in a situation where actually, and this was something that is, I think, causing problems for the work programme, but also for previous programmes, where there's relatively poor information on which bidders can base their bids, and also that the department can assess things. So, I mean, what's your reflections about both the use of pilots, but then what's the alternative, and how does that inform how should that inform your contracting? Should you have discovery phases in contracting, etc.?
Yeah, can I, in a sense, add to that? Because, under Labour, there were going to be pilots of the work programme, in the sense you pay out a benefit savings as your way of rewarding the contractors. And there were pilots planned by you, I think. But new government's gone for full-scale implementation. So the two. Pilots, good idea, bad idea?
I mean, it's worth saying pilots are very often because of money. And a big I think something we should talk about is the fact that throughout this period, I think probably the Treasury was more sceptical about the effectiveness of spending money on getting people back into work than maybe DWP itself was. And we were much better able at getting money out of the Treasury for things which were evidenced, like more work-focused interviews, for example, or sometimes changes to disregards, than a big intervention of this kind. And actually a lot of the debate, which ended up being played out in the media as it's for or against the use of the private sector, actually was much more about is there evidence that spending money in this way on the long-term unemployed or on the disabled is really going to make a fundamental difference. And I think in terms of pilots, a huge amount of this policy was piloted, and indeed Pathways was partly abandoned because in the end the evidence didn't live up to the pilot. So pilots can have a virtue. On the other hand, they can be pretty slow. An example of where pilots have worked pretty well has been family intervention projects, I would say, where the team at DFE have sort of protected that very sort of jealously, didn't want it to be rolled out too quickly. On the other hand, you look at Sure Start and all of that, and even though that was probably pushed out faster than a strict piloting would have ensured, at least you've ended up with a policy which is national and now sort of irreversible. So I think it's slightly horses for courses.
The in-house sort of joke in DWP for many years was we had more pilots than British Airways, and there was undoubtedly times when we just had too many, and some pilots were introduced for all the right reasons, and some were introduced for quite a few of the wrong reasons. I was always keener on not so much pilots, but it seemed to me essentially a political judgment. Did you want to test something out and before you decided whether to do it or not? But the sort of first cousin to pilots were tended to be called things like pathfinders, i.e. you were intent on doing something, but before rolling it out with a huge big bang, you started in a smaller number of places to see what the practical issues and problems you were going to find were. Because if you only find those out when you've suddenly gone national and the problem is now recurring everywhere, it's a very big problem to solve.
Yeah. And do you think there's a lesson more generally there? Because it does strike me that the classic thing is you set up a pilot, you place it back in, go away and evaluate it, nothing happens for 3.5 years. And maybe the public sector needs to get neater at evolving as it goes along by saying this is the direction we're going in. So in a sense, pathfinders in your word, but adapting as you go along with a policy that you've not rolled out nationally.
Yes, I have a lot of sympathy with that.
But I think one of the kind of issues here is to kind of remember the kind of the locking in of a kind of an approached evidence-based policy that Labour was locked into from about 2000, 2001. And the kind of crude interpretation of is you test something, you're committed to it, we're in a non-ideological way, it's what works, what doesn't work, that kind of rhetoric. And then we translate it into a standard operating manual and deliver it in a clunky way down on the ground. Now, the whole thing about, or one of the kind of dimensions of the work programme post-Freud, the movement to flexible New Deal, is we don't want to do that anymore. We're not interested in process. What we want is outcomes. Now, one of the tests for this new market, I think, in the future, and one that's going to be very interesting to see how it adapts, is can it shorten that innovation cycle? Can it work out how to do things very quickly? It doesn't need evidence. Its knowledge of what's going to be going on the ground is going to be granular, quicker, faster than the department itself. And I think one of the big issues and one of the challenges for the department and for government and for accountability is going to be, well, actually there's a lot of things going on out there that they don't actually know about. Maybe they don't want to know because that might be producing better outcomes, but it may come back to bite you. And that's one of the experiences in service delivery systems, as happened in Australia with the big parking and creaming issues that came up there. So be careful what you wish for is one of the kind of messages here.
And is there a question there as well, if you have, half a dozen prime providers, how do they learn from each other?
Well, they are learning from each other, actually. There's an awful lot of sharing that goes on across the prime contractor community and the subcontractors, and actually they're very, very open. I wanted to pick up Chris's point about how you deliver adjustments, policy adjustments, or in a contract environment. Given the work programme was a big bang approach, rolled out, etc., not everything perfect, but you've got contracts there. Are they set in stone in relation to this? When you need a learning process, actually, because it wasn't piloted, not everything is known. And I think that there's a tension where you've actually got a mutual dependency between the government and that of the mutual interest, an interdependency between government and providers, but at the same time you've got a contract relationship. And some of the language is very contractual, big stick type stuff. But actually, you can't, it's in the public interest to have the sort of dialogue which delivers the sort of adjustments which may be necessary in a learning process. And that isn't necessarily a straightforward thing to achieve, but it's there, that tension is very much there.
There was a hand up at the back.
Thank you. Hi there. I'm Tom Richmond. I'm head of policy at G4S Welfare.avi, one of the prime contractors on the work programme. It's been a really interesting discussion, but one of the things that stuck out for me is not so much what has been said, but what hasn't been said about, well, we talked about governments, talked about outsourcing, talked about the evolution of the market, we talked about primes, but we haven't talked much about subcontractors. I think with the work programme and the speed at which it was introduced and the lack of sort of comparable performance data, I think subcontractors had a fairly sort of weak hand to play, and primes really had to get things done and get things done quickly, and subs almost had to play along. But in the select committee response that we put in at the end of last year, and the question was asked, what do you think the role of subcontractors is going to be? We said quite openly that far from being the weaker players in the work programme, we think the best subcontractors over time potentially could become just as powerful, if not more powerful, than some of the prime contractors, because they'll be able to start dictating terms of the contracts far more so than they can now. And I'm just interested in the panel's views of, say, if we had the same discussion in 5 years' time, and we're looking at learning from history and how the market's been shaped, what role are the subcontractors going to play in this, and does the government need to encourage it in any way, or can it just let nature take its course?
Perhaps I might just say something on that. I mean, Kirsty said earlier on that, if I'm quoting you right, Kirsty, that she didn't think this was one of the pieces that was, you know, completely in place.
Voluntary sector subcontractors, some of the private sector.
Yeah, and let me talk about that, the sort of third sector providers, where I have no doubt about the good intentions. I think they're entirely genuine. I think government primes want to involve third sector providers, because there's an awful lot of sort of public interest in doing so, but secondly, some of them can operate in niches and spaces that big primes will inevitably find it difficult to do. But I don't think we've completely worked out just how difficult it can be for third sector providers to play in that space. And it goes back to the colleague asking about risk. If I take the charity whose board I chair, which is a homelessness charity, medium-sized, well-run, effective, but capacity to take risk very, very small, if you see what I mean. Capacity to put money, not even at risk, but simply up front, in the hope that income will come in several months down the line. Very limited indeed. And I think we just have to understand better the nature of most third sector organisations. I'm talking about well-run ones here, not those in probably we wouldn't want to play a part. Other than the very biggest, I think, they probably need more support than the system is currently providing.
Just sort of say in relation to this, I think the rapidity of the procurement of the work programme, which was great, to Alan there, testament to the department. They did fantastically well in terms of getting that up and running in the time they did. However, that put huge tensions, had a huge impact on the ability of the primes and the subcontractors to have the conversations that they needed to. It was a very short time scale. I think some of the implications of that have sort of, come out after that, in terms of people not necessarily valuing themselves properly in terms of subcontractors. Some contracts being signed that maybe they should have sort of held out and had a better one. A lot of stuff which is just around how quickly everything was pushed through. Pros and cons about that decision. We talk about subcontracting and people automatically talk about the role of the third sector. And actually the subcontracting community is far broader than that. And there are some very powerful, very good subcontractors out there. And there's a lot of small ones who've got huge amounts of expertise who aren't in the position to be able to take on contracts. There's a lot of thought, well, the prime contractors will just sort of take on all the financial risk and they won't sort of pass any down the supply chain. The finance of the work programme are very tight. It's very difficult for any prime contractor just to do that, and I think we need to be open about it.
Can I sort of raise an issue there? But it also strikes me that when government says it shifted the risk, and ministers have been quite open, some people will fail. Some contractors, primes might fail in their delivery. It strikes me that if the way it is done is that it shifts the financial risk down to third sectors and small providers so that they are actually themselves financially at risk, you could destroy some of those before a prime goes bust, and actually what you've done is you've removed total capacity.
The question is about the fair sharing of risk, isn't it?
But that seems to be the risk in the way it's being run at the moment that was not there in the flexible New Deal in the same way.
But I think...
Sorry, Dan, carry on.
On more my point would be that I think this is the logic of where the market is going. There's going to be a shakeout of the subcontractors. Yeah, there are going to be fewer of them in 3 to 5 years' time than there are today. That's going to be exacerbated. And one of the difficulties for the work programme is you're going to get a lot of flack for all the other cuts that are working their way through local authorities and local government, and that are affecting the same kind of group of providers. But that shakeout is going to have two kinds of impacts on the voluntary sector, looking at other kinds of systems. Australia, the United States, places like this, which is that some third sector organisations will thrive in this new market. They will become better at what they do. They will become larger organisations. They will win more kind of contracts. Other ones will slip out of the market for all kinds of reasons. So I think we shouldn't be shy of that kind of logic. The other kind of thing is we want to see that, because in the future, when we want more competition for the prime contracts, which, believe me, 5 years goes quick, and we have to start thinking about, work programme Mark II and what's going to be there in the kind of future. One of the things they found in places like Australia, it's the subcontractors who become the competitors of the future, because there aren't going to be a lot of new entrants coming into this market in the future. So you want those subcontractors to thrive, but you don't want them all to be in there.
Oh yes, Tom Gash from the Institute for Government, working on the competition choice and markets programme that we're running here at the moment. I'm going to take you back to the history, and one of the observations about introducing new commissioning models or markets that you can see currently playing out in something like GP commissioning is that you've got to take a workforce and the public along with you in order to make this happen in the long run. And I was just wondering what elements seem to work for you as you went through doing this.
I guess in a way the answer is maybe not very helpful from the point of view of an issue like GP commissioning, but it's, the answer is essentially that the workforce didn't really exist, or insofar as they exist, they were employed by DWP or in very small providers, often people starting themselves up. So, someone like A4E, their origins in Sheffield wasn't going to come out and be against this policy. This was a great thing for them. So there wasn't a great vested interest against it. I think the fact that PCS were not a Labour affiliated trade union is not irrelevant. They had less political muscle in that way to sort of try. If you compare this to the CWU's role over Royal Mail privatisation, that's an interesting thing to compare. And I think, in general, people who are unemployed or who are on other benefits just have a less strong voice than many other groups, and therefore, insofar as they had objections to this, if they had, they would have been less able to make them as prominent. So I think those are very key issues in other markets, but in this one, it's sort of the dog that didn't bark, I would say.
And a small PS to what James has said, with which I agree, is that I think one of the successes over this year, over these years, over this journey, has been that government has become much better and much more professional at procuring. And kind of one of my former colleagues, Alan Cave, who's charted huge progress in this area, is in the audience. But I think compared with 10, certainly 20 years ago, when procurement was a backwater function, of which the average permanent secretary barely knew anything at all, and you put into it people who sort of failed to deliver the bill or the policy, etc., etc. I think we've seen a sea change. I think the other thing that was got right actually along the way was that at a certain point we moved procurement from the agency into the core department, and that was, I think, that created a clearer separation and understanding of the respective roles. So I think procurement has been over time one of the success stories of this programme.
I think we've got time for a couple more. There's one right at the back, if the microphone can get there, then one right down the front.
Thank you. Hugh Lloyd, work at the Office of Public Management. Builds on the health question and some of Dan's observations about variety and how these things play out. Last week we ran a simulation of the health service in the middle of next year to just explore how some of the market and non-market situation would turn out. In terms of what you've experienced, at what level do you think contestability is working? What's the scale question in terms of locality or size of population, the relative balance between size of providers? Because having worked in a tech and in a provider many, many years ago, the most obvious lessons I could see in the health simulation for commissioning groups, health and well-being boards and providers, was to learn some lessons from the whole tech experience. So I wondered whether you had some observations about scale and where the contestability is happening.
I guess I'd answer that in a slightly different way, which is I don't think you can say in the abstract one scale works and one scale doesn't. I would say that there are choices. You know, that there are advantages to a devolved or contestable system. You know, you get more innovation, you get more self-reforming impetus, you get more variation, but you also probably get higher costs and less manoeuvrability in some ways from the centre. And so, you know, when a department or a minister is thinking about this, they need to not pretend to themselves they can have everything at the same time. Sometimes you've got something relatively standardised, you want to do it cheaply, go for a big machine, maybe a machine that you own and control from the centre. If, on the other hand, you want something which is, you know, the other kind I've just described, you need to devolve and make it contestable. And I think it's really important to do that because politicians in particularly these days, end up defining themselves by the methods that they follow. You know, I'm someone who really believes in the role of the state. I really believe in the private sector and choice. And actually, I think a lot of those things are pragmatic decisions which need to be based on evidence. I also think it's very important to remember that this is only one arrow in the quiver, as it were. And I think important as this has been, and that, you know, as much as there has been some consensus, quite a lot of consensus around the use of contestability in welfare, I think actually if you go back from the picture, there are some areas where there's less agreement. And I think in particular, the thing which hasn't been solved across the whole of this history is the one which was right there at the beginning with New Deal for Young People, which what happens after they've done one of their 5 options. You know, you had people recycling onto the system, and the one thing which I think the government is making a mistake over, the biggest thing I think they're making a mistake over in this area is getting rid of the job guarantee, because I thought that was the way of dealing with that problem. Both people who want to play the system, but also people who weren't able to get into work under any of those schemes. You need something which is the kind of backstop and gets them a job. And I think the great advantage of that is that it activated the system. I think in retrospect, it's interesting to think about pensions policy where we created a consensus and it's continuing pretty much as it was. And this area where we didn't create a consensus, we actually didn't bring the industry with us, because actually the Future Jobs Fund was carried out by charities and the public sector, and maybe in retrospect that wasn't very pragmatic. But I think actually having that final jigsaw puzzle was very, very important. And I think another thing we didn't quite work out is how all those bits fitted together. I think maybe in retrospect we should have had Job Centre Plus doing everything up to 6 months, then a contestable period from 6 months to a year or 18 months, and then the job guarantee coming in after that. And I think you would have had a pretty coherent system at that stage.
David Simmons, Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion. In every market there's a hidden hand, and in this one it's the Treasury. And I hate to do this to folk at this time of night, but nobody has mentioned the importance of the Amy Dell switch. In other words, being able to use, in simplistic terms, being able to use benefit savings to pay for outcomes. Now, I raise this at this time within the context of this debate because actually looking back, what really hamstrung Labour policy in moving as fast as you might have wanted to was the resistance against all odds of the Treasury to agree to that benefit savings. And you know, there was no end of civil servants that were reinforcing that, and no end of civil servants that were saying to me, David Freud has got a snowballs in hell's chance of actually getting this through. The reality is that he did, maybe not in exactly the same form as he is originally anticipating, but we've got the work programme structure now, and that evolution has been able to happen far faster because that deal was done. Debate.
I think I knew that pigs were finally flying when I was told one morning during my time as Perm Sec that the words Amy Dell had been spoken on the Today programme during a discussion. this may be first for me, really, but actually I think you occasionally need someone to speak up for the Treasury, because remember, the Treasury have heard any number of promises over any number of years from any number of spending departments which say, as long as you give me this amount of cash, I will bring you such riches as you have never seen and will never believe, etc., etc. The trouble is that on the relatively few occasions when that has been agreed to, the treasure trove has been often very late, if ever arriving. Actually, I think in my time we got to rather a grown-up point in our relationships with Treasury. You know, I don't know what it's been like in the last year and a half, but actually I think we got to a point where there were serious discussions going on in which people understood the competing issues and got to some fairly sensible outcomes.
Jane?
I want to agree with that. I would just say one thing in defence of the argument, which is, I think certainly because of the split between Amy and Dell, benefits expenditure versus departmental spending, very crudely for anybody who's not a great aficionado of the language in this particular instance. Because of that, there had been too much of a focus on the running costs of the DWP and not enough on, certainly from, within the department, you didn't have the incentive to control the much bigger budget, which was the benefits bill. And you did sometimes end up with perverse consequences. Having said that, Amy Dell switches, particularly done through Investor Save, done through the market in the way I was describing earlier, is a workaround. And it's a workaround that if the Treasury and the department can't get it solved between themselves. And I'm very happy to be corrected, but I'm not sure that the work programme is a big Investor Save programme or a big Amy Dell programme. I don't see huge evidence of people having gone out there and raised a huge bond to get extra money to go into the interventions in their prime. You know, why have Ingeus paired up with Deloitte? It's for exactly that reason, to have a sort of, to have that internalised rather than going out to the market to do it. And actually to defend the Treasury, as Lee has just done, arguably Pathways shows that the Treasury were maybe right to be sceptical. You know, we were promising all these improvements and actually they didn't materialise. And where the Treasury were convinced that there was going to be a big effect on the benefits bill from spending lots of money up front on unemployment, they did exactly that. You know, when I went in to negotiate with Alistair and Yvette for more money, the department, after the recession is starting to hit, the department said, "You're mad, you'll never get more than 50 million quid, we should just do some initiatives." We got £5 billion out of them, and it's now well documented that unemployment has been lower than it would otherwise have been because there was an active labour market. And I think that's one thing which, in terms of the public debate, is really never understood, which is actually keeping unemployment from rising too quickly depends on being slightly tougher than you would think was expected at a time of rising unemployment, but also much more supportive. It costs money, and the big mistake that was made in the 80s was that not enough money was spent, and this time a huge amount of money was spent very well by the department actually, and they'll never get any credit for it. The job centres didn't fall over in the recession. I remember Lee used to get very, very upset because every time this came up, there would be a picture of the job centre right round the corner from Victoria, where I can't remember why there was sometimes a queue there. It was people waiting to get in at 9 o'clock in the morning.
It used to shut until 9:30 for staff training, and that meant that people used to queue from 9 o'clock to get in. So every time they wanted a and they managed to get this picture, and they therefore put this one picture up repeatedly, the dole queue, etc. And I used to completely fulminate. I had to be washed down by the Secretary of State.
I had to tell my permanent secretary he shouldn't read the papers quite so much and take it quite so much to heart. But it was a bit unfair because there weren't any queues, and that was, and that was down to the department delivering.
One should never pick one's audience, but Andrew, you don't want to comment on the Treasury's position, do you?
I don't think I can improve on what Lee and James. I don't think I can improve on what Lee and James have said.
Yeah, fine. We're getting close to the time where we should have a glass of wine, I think. But just can I just ask two more broad questions before we go? One is that could it have been done completely differently? I mean, we've talked a bit about keeping Job Centre Plus as the sort of factory for the short contact. Other countries have privatised the whole lot. Australia and the Netherlands. Have we not done that purely for cultural reasons, or did anyone look at it closely and say, this is not a sensible idea?
Well, Centrelink isn't privatised in Australia. Still,
the job network.
Yeah. So the
Half
job,
of what Job Centre Plus does.
Yeah. So it's actually pretty similar to here, and
well, it goes quite a bit further.
Well, no, I mean, the big difference is when you go into a Centrelink, you don't have as active a work-related conversation because you're handed on. It's basically a benefits conversation. So I think the big downside of the Australian system is you go in, you have a benefits conversation, and then you're handed on to a provider, and there's often lots of people who don't. That's not ideal. But Centrelink is publicly owned. The job providers are mostly private and voluntary, or private voluntary. You could do it differently. You could have contestability between job centres. Frank Field actually urged us to do that during the system, but during this period. But actually, I think that's where you have a choice. You either have a big machine and you can control it from the centre, or you have contestability, but then you'd have less control and more variability.
And I think we've got a situation now where lots of other governments are coming over and looking at what we're doing. I get providers ringing me up saying, "Oh, I'm off to the Middle East, don't tell anyone." And somebody else rings me up, "Off to the Middle East, don't tell anyone." And you realise we've all gone to the Middle East. But there's a serious point that we are seen at the moment as being at the forefront of public service reform in relation to welfare to work. And so the eyes are on the UK to see how we're doing it, and I think the lessons will be shared overseas.
Kirsty, the same people were visiting when the new deals arrived, the same people were visiting when Job Centre Plus was open.
Are you telling me they're all on holiday, Dan?
No, this is also about how you legitimise certain kinds of uncomfortable changes in your own country by visiting another one that's perceived to be successful and getting the photos outside Job Centre Plus, minus the queue, in time for prime news in your kind of respective home countries. Because I guess the kind of sense we're kind of heading towards and winding up, one of the things I've got to say very, very clearly here is it strikes me as very telling that, yet again, we've hardly talked about service users and about the experience of the clients who are going to be going through this system. And if I had observations to make, which I've made on many occasions, is the weaknesses in this system that buttress the kind of the service user experience, in particular for tens of thousands of people who won't get jobs at the end of this. Some of the people James was kind of referring to implicitly in terms of a future job guarantee. There will be mandatory work activity, as I understand it, coming up at the end of their kind of participation in the programme. And crucially, taking it back to kind of one of the core themes, as I understood it, of the seminar series that the IFG is starting to run, is the strapline talks about choice. There actually isn't any in the work programme for service users. It's random allocation and compulsion. That's a very different world to the notion of choice that I think is implicit in the strapline you're running. And I think one of the key factors that will, how can I say, it could have been done so much better and so much easier.
There was some discussion of offering people choice by appointing more than one provider in an area, wasn't there? I mean, there was certainly some discussion about that.
And it was
as a performance incentive on the providers.
Part of the model, yeah. The employment zones went down that road, the flexible New Deal. I'm trying to remember whether it actually had the notion of choice in there. But choice is out of it. Maybe informed, well-informed service users as they come into the programme. I'm hoping so, but what I see is people being moved about, randomly allocated, and their first experience of this programme, because let's not forget, for quite a lot of the people, the experience of this programme isn't going to be that different to what they've already been through. In fact, in many cases, it's going to be the same providers they're actually doing. In my local patch, there aren't this influx of new providers coming into the trade. It's the same subcontractors that were delivering the New Deal before that. So, I thought a great opportunity to say to people that you're actually experiencing something different. There's a new deal for you in this experience has been missed, frankly.
Yeah. James.
I think you need to be careful about what you mean by choice, because there's different types of choice. I mean, the DWP internal view was always that choice between providers hadn't been shown to have much effect. People seemed to decide on distance rather than on anything else. But certainly what the Gregg review tried to do was to give people choice and control over their pathway back to work, and trying to have the sanctions and the powers as the last resort, but giving people more control over that journey and the things that they wanted to do. I just want to pick up slightly the point about work-related activity or mandatory work activity, which is very different from a minimum wage job. And all of the evidence is if you put people into a work that they wouldn't want to put on their CV, whether it's whatever it may be, and if it's not paid properly, and if it's not something which leads to progression, then actually the evidence is that doesn't help people get closer to work, actually distances them from work. And certainly what we were hoping to do with the Future Jobs Fund is to do exactly the opposite.
Right. One last thing before we break up. Looking at the experience of this sector, if you were looking at introducing markets contestability in other areas, is there kind of one thing that you pick out from what's happened in the welfare to work experience that you might encourage people to remember? Or is that too difficult?
I think it's the thing that Lee was, for me anyway, it's the thing that Lee said, which was you have to have a really clear commissioning provider split. And I think it was a bit of ad hocery that the commissioning was being done within Job Centre Plus, and I think it has worked much better now that it's been put into the department, because those are very specific skills, and Alan has a very different set of skills, quite rightly, from the one that someone who's running a job centre would do, and that's that you have to have that. You have to be good at commissioning if you're going to run a good commissioning system.
The one for me would be don't overpromise. Something like the work programme isn't a magic bullet. It isn't a magic bullet for the voluntary sector in terms of the impact of local government funding cuts. It's not a magic bullet for the impact of the economy and lots of people's lives. It has the potential to be a very good programme. It has a range of issues around it which the providers are trying to work through, but it's not going to transform the world.
I think one for me is that however important price is, it's only one ingredient in the decision-making process. It is terribly difficult, if provider A is offering you whatever it is at X and provider B is offering it at kind of half X. But nevertheless, you have to look at those offerings in the round. And I think just occasionally still, right across government, we're too inclined to contract with too great an emphasis just on price.
My only choice would be, my final kind of comment would be that be careful, both in this sector and in other kind of sectors, that what will be a future voice and a very loud voice, which will be the provider interest, isn't the same as service users, but it will be articulated in that way.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's grand. And the next in this series will be on social care on the Thursday, the 15th of March, and the invites to that will be going out shortly. And there are drinks on the stairs, on the landing here, an opportunity to carry on the discussion. But first of all, can we thank you very much, all you very much indeed, for coming? Can you thank the panel for what I think has been a very stimulating and